Have you ever wondered how a single act of kindness could turn a life upside down? Black widow with 2 daughters rescues injured millionaire on the side of the road. He changes her life forever. Blood trickled down the unconscious man's forehead as Diane Williams slammed on the brakes of her 23-year-old Honda Civic. It was almost midnight on a back road in Alabama, and any sensible person would have simply driven on, especially a black woman driving alone with 2 sleeping daughters in the back seat. But Diane was never one to ignore someone in trouble. The stranger was lying next to a black BMW that had been totaled, his expensive clothes torn and covered in dirt, even injured and vulnerable. Something about his posture revealed that this man was used to being in charge, not needing help. His $1,000 Italian shoes contrasted starkly with the worn work boots Diane wore after another double-shift cleaning offices in downtown Birmingham. "Mom, why did we stop?" whispered Kesha, her 12-year-old daughter, waking up to the sound of the old engine coughing and sputtering in need of repair for months. "Someone's hurt here, honey," Diane replied, already getting out of the car. At 35, she had learned that life could change in seconds, like when her husband James died in a construction accident 3 years ago, leaving her alone with 2 girls and a mountain of medical bills. The man groaned as she approached. He was in his 40s with graying hair at his temples, and even unconscious, he exuded the authority that comes from never having to ask anyone for anything. His gold Rolex glinted in the light of Diane's cell phone as she checked his pulse. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, gently touching his shoulder. He opened his eyes slowly, confused and disoriented. When he focused on Diane's worried face above him, his expression changed from vulnerability to something harder, more calculating. It was as if even injured, he was instantly assessing the situation and the people around him. Where am I?" he muttered, trying to sit up and wincing in pain. "On Route 17, about 20 miles outside Birmingham," Diane explained, offering support. "Your car rolled over. You need medical attention." The man looked at her, really looked at her, and Diane recognized that expression. It was the same one she saw on the faces of the executives whose offices she cleaned every night, surprised that someone like her could be offering help, followed by a quick calculation of what it might cost. "I'm Richard Davidson," he said, as if the name should mean something. And it probably did to people who moved in circles very different from Diane's. "Diane Williams," she replied simply. "These are my daughters, Kesha and Amara. We're going to take you to the hospital." Richard tried to protest, saying he could take care of himself. But when he tried to stand, his legs gave way. There was something deeply unsettling about the vulnerability of this man who was clearly used to controlling everything around him. During the drive to the hospital, in the backseat of the noisy Honda, Richard Davidson, CEO of Davidson Industries, as Diane would later discover, remained silent. But his eyes in the rearview mirror revealed a confusion that went beyond his head injury. It was as if he were trying to process how he had ended up in the backseat of an old car being saved by a woman he normally wouldn't even notice. What will happen next? Will this rescue lead to an unexpected twist? Stay tuned to Black Voices to find out. What Richard didn't know was that Diane Williams wasn't just an ordinary cleaning lady. She had a degree in business that she had never been able to use because of systemic racism, a strategic mind sharpened by the need to survive, and an inner strength forged by loss and daily struggle. As the hospital lights approached, Diane watched through the rearview mirror as this powerful man was reduced to the most human state possible, completely dependent on the kindness of strangers. At the hospital, Richard Davidson was treated with a deference reserved for men of his social standing. Nurses rushed to attend to him. Doctors appeared instantly, and the unit director made a point of personally supervising his care. Diane watched all this from the corner of the emergency room holding 9-year-old Amara on her lap while Kesha stood beside her. Both girls impressed by the commotion. "Just a few stitches and a mild concussion," announced Dr. Peterson, a gray-haired man who treated Richard like royalty. "But I recommend observation for 24 hours, Mr. Davidson." Richard waved impatiently. "I don't have time to stay in the hospital. I have a board meeting tomorrow that's worth $40 million. It was then that he really noticed Diane for the first time since the accident. She stood there quietly with his 2 daughters, waiting just to make sure he was okay before leaving. Something about the scene bothered him deeply. Perhaps her natural dignity or the fact that his daughters were perfectly well behaved despite the late hour and strange hospital environment. "Are you still here?" he asked as if her presence was an inconvenience. "Thanks for the ride. My assistant is on his way to pick me up." Diane nodded simply. "I'm glad you're okay, Mr. Davidson." But Richard wasn't finished. There was something about her demeanor that irritated him, an absence of the submissiveness he had expected to find. "Listen," he said, taking his wallet out of his pocket. "Let me compensate you for the gas and the inconvenience." He held out a $20 bill as if he were tipping a valet. Diane looked at the money, then at him. "No, sir, Mr. Davidson. Anyone would have done the same thing." "Don't be proud," Richard insisted, forcing the bill toward her. "I know people like you need every penny." The silence that followed was tense. Kesha frowned, instinctively sensing the disrespect, but Diane placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. "People like me," Diane repeated calmly. Richard realized he had stepped on dangerous ground, but his privilege spoke louder. "You know, hardworking, simple people. There's no shame in that." Dr. Peterson cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly wanting to escape the conversation. Diane remained motionless for a moment, studying Richard's face with an intensity that made him shift uneasily on the stretcher. "I work 3 jobs to support my daughters," she said finally, her voice remaining even. "I've cleaned the offices at Davidson Industries every night for 2 years." The information hit Richard like a slap. He looked at her again, trying to connect this woman with the invisible figures who cleaned his corporate building after hours. People he never really saw who existed only on the periphery of his consciousness as part of the necessary but expendable infrastructure of his professional life. "Oh," was all he could say. 15th floor, southeast corner. "Your office," Diane continued, a small smile appearing on her lips. "You work late on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You always leave 3 half-finished cups of coffee on your desk and piles of contracts that you review with a specific red pen." Richard's discomfort was palpable now. She had observed his habits, knew his patterns, had access to information about his routine that he never considered anyone could notice or memorize. "You pay a lot of attention to detail," he muttered. "I have to," Diane replied. "My job depends on being invisible and efficient, on knowing each executive's patterns so I don't get in the way." Amara yawned on her mother's lap, reminding everyone of the late hour. Diane rose gracefully. "We have to go. Tomorrow is a school day." "Wait," Richard said, something in his voice changing. "You said you have 3 jobs." "I clean offices at night, work at a grocery store on weekends, and do house cleaning when I can," Diane explained without a trace of self-pity. "James, my husband, died leaving medical bills. I do what I have to do." For a moment, Richard saw beyond his own prejudices. He saw a woman who worked tirelessly, raised 2 daughters on her own, and still had stopped to help a stranger injured on a dark road. He saw someone whose quiet strength contrasted brutally with his own vulnerability that night. "Diane," he said, using her name for the first time. Can I do anything? Any favors?" "You saved my life." Diane studied him for a long moment. There was something in her eyes that Richard couldn't quite place. A sharp intelligence that seemed to be evaluating and calculating things he didn't understand. "Actually," she said slowly, "there's something I've always wanted to ask you about Davidson Industries." Richard leaned forward, curious. "I read in the paper about the acquisition of Hartwell Construction last month. $50 million. James worked there before he died," Diane said, her voice remaining neutral. "I always wondered how small family-owned businesses manage to compete against corporations that can simply buy up any competitor that becomes inconvenient." The question caught Richard off guard. It wasn't the kind of inquiry he expected from a cleaning lady. There was a sophistication in the way she phrased it that suggested knowledge of corporate strategy that went far beyond what her current position would indicate. It's the business world," he replied, suddenly defensive. "Free competition." "Free competition," Diane repeated as if testing the words. "Interesting concept. At that moment, Richard's personal assistant arrived, a nervous young man in an expensive suit who treated Diane and her daughters like inconvenient furniture as he organized his boss's departure. "Mr. Davidson, your car is waiting." "Your wife is worried," he announced, barely glancing at Diane. "Of course," Richard said, rising from the stretcher. He hesitated for a moment, looking at Diane. "Listen, if you need anything." "We're fine," Diane replied. But her eyes revealed something deeper. A quiet determination that made Richard wonder what exactly was going on in this woman's mind. As they left the hospital, Kesha finally spoke. "Mommy, why did that man talk to you like that?" Diane stopped in the parking lot, watching the black limousine carry Richard Davidson back to his world of privilege. "Because some people think money gives them the right to treat others as inferior, sweetheart." "But you're not inferior," Amara declared with the absolute certainty of children. "No, I'm not," Diane agreed, a mysterious smile crossing her face. "And maybe it's time some people learned that." Could this be the beginning of a powerful transformation? Keep watching Black Voices to see how this story unfolds. What Richard Davidson didn't know was that Diane Williams had spent the last 2 years observing much more than just work patterns at Davidson Industries. Every conversation overheard, every document left on desks, every corporate strategy discussed in meetings she cleaned up after, all had been carefully noted and memorized by a mind trained in management that had finally found a way to use her education in a way no one would ever suspect. 2 weeks after the encounter at the hospital, Diane returned to her night shift at Davidson Industries as if nothing had happened. But something fundamental had changed. She was no longer an invisible employee performing mechanical tasks. She was a woman with a purpose, and every office she cleaned became a potential source of valuable information. On her first night back, she found Richard working late, just as she had expected. He barely looked up when she entered to empty the trash cans, treating her like part of the furniture, an invisibility she now saw as her greatest advantage. "Diane, right," he said distractedly, without looking up from his laptop. "I forgot to thank you properly for your assistance on the road." "No need to thank me, Mr. Davidson," she replied methodically, continuing her work. "Actually, you do. Let me compensate you properly," Richard said, opening the drawer and taking out an envelope. $500. "I know that for people in your situation, it can make a difference." Diane stopped cleaning and looked at the envelope held out toward her. This was the second time he had tried to pay her for her basic humanity, as if kindness were a service that could be purchased. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Davidson, but as I said before, it's not necessary." Richard frowned, clearly annoyed by her refusal. "Look, Diane, I know you have pride, but don't be silly. Take the money. It's a generous offer." "Generous?" Diane repeated, testing the word. "Interesting choice of term. What do you mean?" Richard asked, finally giving the conversation his full attention. "Nothing, Mr. Davidson, just observing that generosity means different things to different people." There was something about her tone that bothered him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Diane finished cleaning the office in silence, but her eyes carefully registered every document on the desk, every half-open folder, every phone conversation he made, thinking he was alone. Over the next few days, Diane established a careful routine. She arrived at the building early, creating opportunities to overhear conversations in the hallways. She cleaned each room meticulously, especially during important meetings that took place after normal working hours. And she'd barely acknowledged her existence. "Long night again?" Marcus asked one Thursday, finding Diane in the elevator at 11 o'clock at night. "They always are," she replied with a tired smile. "You know, I've been watching you for months. Always professional, always discreet. I bet you see and hear interesting things around here." Diane studied him carefully. Marcus was in his 40s, wore suits that clearly came from affordable stores, not Italian tailors, and there was something in his eyes that suggested experience with real-world injustices. "Sometimes," she admitted cautiously. "I work primarily with workplace discrimination cases," Marcus said casually. "I'm always impressed by what cleaning staff can witness. You guys are practically invisible to the executives." The conversation planted a seed in Diane's mind. Over the next few weeks, she began paying special attention to Davidson Industries meetings, especially those involving layoffs, hostile takeovers, and strategies that seemed deliberately harmful to smaller communities. On one particularly productive night, she photographed a series of emails between Richard and the company's board about the acquisition of Hartwell Construction, the same company where James had worked. The documents revealed a calculated strategy. First, Davidson had deliberately sabotaged several of Hartwell's contracts, then offered to buy the distressed company for a fraction of its actual value. But it was during an executive meeting on human resource optimization that Diane discovered something that made her blood boil. Richard casually discussed laying off a large number of outsourced cleaning staff, including several black women who had worked in the building for years, and replacing them with a cheaper automated company. "They're easily replaceable," she heard Richard say on the phone to the CFO. "Unskilled, no value-added work. We'll save $300,000 a year. Unskilled, no value-added." The words echoed in Diane's mind as she silently cleaned around the conference table where Richard had spread out charts showing how the layoffs would boost quarterly profits. That evening, Diane sought out Marcus Torres in his office. "I need to talk to you about something important," she said, closing the door behind her. Marcus immediately noticed the change in her demeanor. "I'm listening." If someone had evidence of illegal business practices, systematic discrimination, and corporate sabotage, what could that person do? "It depends on the evidence," Marcus replied, leaning forward with renewed interest. "Are we talking about hypothetical situations, or?" Diane opened her purse and pulled out a thick envelope containing printouts of documents, photographs of emails, and a detailed list of conversations she had witnessed. "There's nothing hypothetical about this," she said, placing everything on Marcus' desk. He spent the next 40 minutes meticulously examining each document, his low whistle of admiration growing as he understood the extent of the evidence Diane had collected. "Diane," he said, "you have enough material here for at least 3 different federal lawsuits: discrimination, corporate fraud, market manipulation." "And revenge?" she asked calmly. Marcus smiled slowly. "Well, I prefer to call it justice, but yes, there's definitely potential for significant consequences." That night, Diane returned home with a sense of power she hadn't felt in years. Kesha and Amara were asleep, but she spent hours at the kitchen table chronologically organizing all the evidence she had collected, creating a comprehensive dossier on the practices of Davidson Industries. The next morning, Richard Davidson woke up with no idea that the unqualified employee he paid to clean his office had spent the previous night methodically building the case that would destroy his reputation, his company, and his arrogance once and for all. What Richard didn't know was that every condescending document he had left on her desk, every arrogant conversation he had thought he had in privacy, every cruel decision he had made with a certainty that there would never be any consequences, all had been carefully documented by someone he considered completely irrelevant. It was when he laughed contemptuously on the phone about people who know their place that something extraordinary began to take shape. Not just in Diane's determined mind, but in the legal reality that was being constructed document by document, piece of evidence by piece of evidence, injustice by catalogued injustice. For a moment, when Richard hung up the phone and went back to completely ignoring Diane's presence as she cleaned around his desk, he couldn't imagine that he was witnessing the last days of his career. Yet another powerful man who completely underestimated the quiet power of those he thought he was controlling without realizing that he had lost the game before he even knew he was playing. Monday morning began as usual for Richard Davidson. He arrived at the office at 7 a.m., as always, hoping to review the final documents for the mass layoff of cleaning staff before the board meeting at 9 o'clock. $300,000 in annual savings that would boost fourth-quarter profits exactly as planned. Diane was there as always, finishing her morning cleaning with her usual quiet efficiency. Richard barely noticed her as he checked his emails, completely oblivious to the fact that his every move was being discreetly observed and recorded. "Good morning, Mr. Davidson," Diane said respectfully, emptying the trash can next to his desk. He replied distractedly, focused on his computer screen. At 8:30, Richard's assistant rushed in. "Sir, there are reporters in the lobby." "Lots of reporters, and the FBI is on their way up." Richard frowned, confused. "The FBI? What are they talking about?" Before he could get an answer, 3 federal agents entered his office, followed by Marcus Torres and 2 other people Richard didn't immediately recognize. "Richard Davidson, you're being subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury," announced the lead agent, handing him official documents. Preliminary charges include corporate fraud, market manipulation, systematic workplace discrimination, and money laundering. Richard's world stopped. "This is ridiculous. I don't know what you're talking about." Marcus stepped forward, his expression professionally calm. "Mr. Davidson, I represent several victims of your illegal business practices. I would like to present some evidence that may clarify the situation." It was then that Richard noticed Diane still standing in the corner of the office, but something had completely changed in her demeanor. She was no longer hunched over cleaning equipment. She stood tall, confident, and her eyes sparkled with a sharp intelligence he had never noticed before. "Diane," he said, genuinely confused. "Actually," Marcus continued, "I'd like you to properly meet Diane Williams, bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Alabama, MBA interrupted due to the death of her husband and our lead witness with direct access to your daily operations." Marcus opened a thick folder on Richard's desk. "Over the past 6 months, Ms. Williams has meticulously documented your illegal practices, recorded conversations, photographs of confidential documents, printed emails, meeting minutes." Richard looked at Diane with a mixture of growing shock and horror. You were spying on me." "I was doing my job," Diane replied calmly. "Cleaning up? It just so happens that I was also cleaning up the moral filth you spread everywhere." Marcus continued relentlessly. "Here we have evidence of the deliberate sabotage of Hartwell Construction, where Mrs. Williams' husband worked. Documents showing how you rigged contracts to force bankruptcy, then bought the company for a fraction of its value." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "Those are just legitimate business strategies." "And here," Marcus said, playing a recording on his laptop, "we have you describing cleaning staff as easily replaceable, unskilled labor, no value added. Interesting description for someone who just collected enough evidence to destroy your company." Richard's voice came clearly from the speakers. "They're easily replaceable. Unskilled labor, no value added. We'll save $300,000 a year." The silence in the office was deafening. Richard looked around the room, realizing for the first time that he was completely surrounded legally, morally, and publicly. "There's also the matter of bribes paid to city inspectors," Marcus continued, "documented in emails you left open on your desk during the nightly cleanup sessions and the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands for tax evasion." Diane finally spoke, her voice maintaining the same calm dignity she had always displayed. "Mr. Davidson, for 2 years, I cleaned this office every night. I watched you celebrate layoffs, laugh at families being destroyed, plan ways to cheat small businesses. I thought you were just a cruel man. I've discovered you're a criminal." Richard turned to her desperately. "Diane, listen. I can explain all of this. I can make it up to you for any misunderstanding." "Make it up to me?" Diane repeated, a sad smile appearing on her lips. "Like the $500 you offered me at the hospital or the $20 for saving your life on the highway." Marcus interrupted. "Mr. Davidson, we've also been contacted by the Atlanta Constitution and Channel 7 News. It seems your story has become quite public." At that moment, Richard's assistant entered again, his face pale. "Sir, the board of directors has called an emergency meeting, and your wife is on the phone. She said she's watching you on television." Richard rushed to his office window and looked down. The parking lot was filled with news vans, reporters with microphones, and a growing crowd of onlookers. His entire life was disintegrating live, broadcast to the entire city. "How," he whispered, turning to Diane. "How did a simple cleaning lady manage to a simple cleaning lady?" Diane interrupted, her voice finally showing a hint of irritation. "Mr. Davidson, invisible people see everything. Underestimated people observe everything, and people with no added value apparently document everything." The federal agent stepped forward. "Mr. Davidson, we need you to come with us for questioning. Your lawyers can meet you at the federal building." As Richard was escorted out of his own office, he paused at the door and looked back at Diane one last time. She was calmly organizing her cleaning supplies as if it were just another normal day at work. "Why?" he asked desperately. "Why are you doing this to me?" Diane stopped what she was doing and looked him straight in the eye. "Because James Williams wasn't just a name on a termination form. He was my husband. He was the father of my children. He was a good man who died working for a company that you deliberately sabotaged." The weight of those words hit Richard like a speeding train. All this time he wasn't being watched by a random employee. He was being studied by the widow of a man whose life he had destroyed without ever bothering to learn his name. "What about the money?" he asked weakly. "The offers I made." "You tried to buy my humanity for $20, Diane replied. "You ended up losing $300 million. Seems like a bad deal, even for someone with your management experience." As the door closed behind Richard Davidson, Diane Williams calmly continued her work. After all, there was still a lot to clean up. And now, for the first time in years, she was cleaning up dirt that really mattered. 6 months later, Davidson Industries had closed its doors for good. Richard Davidson was serving a 16-year sentence for corporate fraud, systematic discrimination, and tax evasion. His mansion was auctioned off to pay compensation to the victims of his criminal practices. Diane Williams sat in her new office on the 20th floor of the same building where she had once cleaned bathrooms. Her corporate compliance consulting firm had grown rapidly, serving corporations that wanted to avoid Davidson's fatal mistakes. "Mom, you have 3 more interview requests," announced Kesha, now 13, as she organized her mother's mail with impressive efficiency. Marcus Torres entered carrying contracts. "IBM wants to hire your services. It seems your reputation for ethical cleaning is spreading across the country." Diane smiled, watching the people walking on the streets below through the window, each with their own struggles, dreams, and dignity that deserved to be respected. That morning, she had received a letter from prison. Richard Davidson finally offered a genuine apology. Too late to save her company or her freedom, but never too late to recognize the humanity he had ignored for so long. The best revenge wasn't destroying Richard Davidson. It was building something bigger than he could ever imagine. Diane proved that underestimated people aren't invisible. They're observant. And when they decide to act, they rewrite the rules of the entire game. If this story of how intelligence and patience defeat arrogance and prejudice has inspired you, subscribe to Black Voices to discover more real stories that prove that justice always finds its way, even when we least expect it.